The Silent Return. The galaxy had almost forgotten the name of the alien queen. For years, her throne had been empty, her voice absent, her armies scattered under generals who fought among themselves. Some said she was dead, destroyed in a distant war. Others whispered that she was alive, watching, waiting, planning her return in the shadows. But none expected her to come back the way she did, without a single word, without a single warning. On that night, the stars above the imperial palace burned strangely bright. The guards on the outer walls noticed first. They saw a shadow slip across the sky, large enough to swallow the moonlight. At first, they thought it was only another warship, perhaps a general returning from battle. But then the shadow grew darker, heavier, until every eye turned upward. The outline of her flagship emerged from the clouds like a ghost from the past. Its black hull carried no banners, no shining symbols of victory. It glided in silence, its engines humming like the breath of some giant beast. The landing bays were thrown into chaos. Ministers ran from their chambers, soldiers formed lines, servants dropped their trays and rushed into corners. No order had been given, no announcement had reached them, yet they all knew. They felt it in their bones. The queen had returned. Fear spread faster than fire. Even the air seemed heavier, thicker, as if it too remembered her presence. The flagship touched the platform with a slow, deliberate weight. No music played. No commander shouted. No herald stepped forward to announce her arrival. The great ramp lowered, the metal groaning against the still night. A fog of cold air spilled out, curling across the ground. And then she appeared. The alien queen stepped into the light. She wore no crown, no golden robe, no jewels to mark her rank. Instead, she walked in simple armor, dark and silent, the kind that whispered of war and blood rather than wealth and power. Her eyes glowed faintly, like twin embers under the shadow of her hood. She did not speak. She did not wave. She did not acknowledge the rows of soldiers kneeling at her feet. She simply walked forward, her steps slow and heavy, echoing across the metal like a drumbeat of dread. Everywhere she passed, silence followed. Generals bowed their heads but dared not breathe too loud. Ministers pressed their lips shut, afraid to draw her attention. Even the machines seemed to quiet, their usual hums and clicks falling still as though the palace itself bowed in respect, or in fear. She moved deeper into the corridors, ignoring the path that should have taken her back to the throne room. Instead, she walked past the grand halls of shining stone and into the older, darker levels of the palace. No one dared to ask why. No one dared to stop her. Her silence was sharper than any command. It told them that she was searching, hunting for something unseen. Whispers grew behind her. Some said she had returned to punish the traitors who whispered of rebellion during her absence. Others believed she had come back to name a new heir, or perhaps to tear down the empire she had built with her own claws. No one knew, and her silence made every guess more terrifying. The queen's memories followed her through the halls. These walls had once echoed with her victories, with the cries of enemies crushed beneath her armies. But they also held shadows of her losses, echoes of her daughter's voice that time could never erase. With each step, her heart burned colder. Her empire had survived without her, but had it obeyed her? Had they honored her rule, or had they betrayed it in her absence? Her guards tried to follow, but she raised a single clawed hand and they froze in place. Alone, she continued down the narrow halls, her eyes fixed forward, her breath calm, though her heart carried storms. Down and down she walked, away from the glittering chambers of the ruling elite and into the working levels where no queen had ever gone. Dust clung to the corners. Rust spread across the pipes. The walls here smelled of oil, of sweat, of forgotten labor. And then, far in the distance, she heard it. A sound that did not belong in her silent palace. A human voice, low and steady, humming a simple tune. It was not a song of battle, not a song of worship, but something softer, something alive. Her steps slowed. Her eyes narrowed. The queen had returned in silence. But now, in the depths of her own palace, she found a silence broken, not by ministers or generals, not by armies or slaves, but by a single human janitor working in the shadows. unaware that the most feared ruler in the galaxy was walking toward him. The human janitor. Far below the grand halls of the palace, in a place where the air was thick with dust and the hum of forgotten machines, a lone human janitor worked in silence. The galaxy never noticed people like him. The aliens who ruled saw humans as weak, soft, unimportant, good only for labor no one else wished to do. And so he had been sent here to mop the endless corridors, to scrape rust from the pipes, to carry tools that no one else wanted to touch. To them, he was invisible, as much a part of the palace as the walls themselves. But unlike the walls, he was alive. His name mattered little to those around him, but he carried it with quiet dignity. His hands were rough and scarred, each mark a memory of labor long before he ever reached this alien world. His back ached from bending to scrub the floors, yet his movements were steady. He worked without complaint, without hurry, with the kind of patience that others mocked as weakness. To him, the work was simple but important. Clean floors meant fewer accidents, polished rails meant safe hands, and each small effort added to something greater. While others looked down on him, he always told himself, "If I do not care about the small things, who will?" That night was no different, at least for him. His mop slid back and forth across the floor, leaving streaks of light behind as he worked. The hall was quiet, except for the sound of water dripping from the bucket and the low hum that came from his own lips. He was humming a tune, soft and steady, a song that belonged to Earth, a melody that reminded him of evenings under warm skies and the sound of his daughter laughing. No one here knew the meaning of his song, but it comforted him. It kept him human in a place that wanted him to be less. As he worked, a small alien servant child stumbled down the hall, arms heavy with a tray far too large for her. Her steps were unsteady, her thin legs shaking under the weight. The tray tilted, food slid, and with a small cry she fell, the meal scattering across the floor. She froze in terror, her tiny eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. In this palace, mistakes were punished swiftly. She knew what it meant to drop food meant for the High Council. Before the child could panic further, the janitor was already kneeling beside her. His voice was calm, his movements gentle. He helped gather the spilled pieces, placed them back on the tray, and gave her a small piece of bread he had hidden in his pocket. The child blinked at him in shock, her fear slowly replaced by something else, something she had almost forgotten existed. Kindness. She whispered a shaky "thank you," her voice trembling, and ran off with the tray, holding it tightly this time. The janitor watched her go and then returned to his mop as though nothing important had happened. To him, it was a small act, something natural, something human. But to anyone watching, it would have been strange, even dangerous. In this empire, kindness was weakness. Mercy was foolish. A servant's mistake was not to be forgiven, but punished, to remind all others to never fail. Yet this man had not hesitated. He had bent down to help without fear, without calculation. It was a simple act, but simple acts sometimes carried the power of storms. The corridors above stirred with sudden footsteps. Ministers rushed about in panic. Generals barked orders. Soldiers armed themselves, for word had spread like wildfire. The Queen had returned. While the higher halls trembled with fear, the janitor remained unaware. He was deep in his work, humming his tune, wiping away the stains left by boots and hands that carried more power than he would ever know. His world was small, his concerns ordinary, yet fate was walking straight toward him. The silence shifted. He felt it before he saw it. The air grew heavier, colder, as if someone had opened a door into a winter storm. His humming slowed, his mop paused in mid-swipe, and his eyes flicked toward the shadows stretching across the floor. He thought at first that it was only one of the generals checking on him, perhaps ready to scold him for working too slowly. But then the sound of steps reached his ears. Measured, slow, deliberate, carrying a weight that no ordinary soldier possessed. The janitor stood straighter, his hand tightening on the handle of the mop. He was not a man of courage in the way soldiers were, but there was a quiet strength in him, the kind that came from surviving, from never giving up even when life ground him down. Still, something in those footsteps chilled him. Something in that silence felt unnatural. Whoever approached was not just anyone. They carried the presence of power, of danger. And then, without fanfare, without guards or drums, the figure appeared. The air seemed to bend around her. She wore dark armor that whispered of ancient wars, and her eyes glowed faintly like embers in the night. She did not announce herself. She did not roar or shout. She simply stood in the doorway, watching. The janitor felt his breath catch in his throat. Though he had never seen her before, he knew at once who she was. The stories, the warnings, the whispered legends told by other servants all came rushing back. This was no general. This was no minister. This was the Queen, and she was watching him. The first glimpse. The janitor's hands slowed as he felt the heavy silence pressing behind him. He had heard stories whispered in the servant halls, stories of the Queen's eyes, eyes that burned like fire, eyes that could strip away lies and pierce into the soul of anyone who stood before her. Now those eyes were on him. He did not need to turn around to know it. The weight of her presence was enough. The very air seemed to bend under it, thick and unyielding, as if the palace itself was holding its breath. Slowly, he straightened, gripping the wooden handle of his mop like a staff. For a moment he thought of fleeing, but his legs would not obey. Fear whispered that a single wrong move would mean his end. Yet something in him resisted bowing, resisted trembling. He was no warrior, no hero, no noble. He was only a man who cleaned. Yet, when he finally turned his head, his eyes met hers, and something passed between them that words could not explain. The alien Queen stood in the doorway, silent, her shadow stretching across the corridor. She did not speak. Her soldiers were nowhere near. She had come alone. Her armor, dark as night, bore the faint scars of countless battles, and her claws twitched as though ready to strike. But her gaze was locked not on his mop or his scars. It was fixed on something else. For in that moment she saw what he had just done. The small alien servant child, still clutching her tray tightly, peeked from around the corner. She had been spared punishment, spared humiliation because this human had helped her. The child's eyes shimmered with gratitude before she ran off, too afraid to linger in the Queen's presence. But the Queen had seen it all. Her mind, sharp and ruthless, was not prepared for what she felt. This was not the cold efficiency of duty, nor the harshness of empire law. This was something alien to her kind, an act with no demand for return, no calculation of gain, a gesture of kindness so simple it disarmed her far more than any blade. She froze where she stood. Memories stirred within her like ghosts clawing at the walls of her heart. Long ago, in a corridor much like this one, her own daughter had once fallen, weak and trembling, clutching something far too heavy for her fragile arms. The Queen had been younger then, more concerned with the throne than the small struggles of her child. When her daughter stumbled, the servants nearby had not moved to help. They had lowered their eyes, fearing the Queen's anger more than they cared for the life of a child. And when the child had later died, frail and unprotected, the Queen had carried that loss like a scar carved into her soul. Now, as she watched a nameless human stoop to help a servant child no one valued, the old wound opened again. She felt the ache of it, the reminder of what she had lost. The world had called her merciless, and she had worn that name like armor. But, in the dim light of this forgotten hall, her silence cracked. Her chest tightened. For the first time in many years, her eyes did not burn with fury. They trembled with something she could not name. The janitor noticed her hesitation. He expected rage, expected claws at his throat, but none came. Instead, she simply stood there, her gaze fixed on him with a strange, unreadable intensity. He did not bow, nor did he pretend courage. He simply nodded once in quiet respect, then bent down to continue his work as though she were any other watcher. The mop glided again across the floor, the rhythm of his movements steady, unshaken. This act startled her more than defiance ever could have. In her empire, beings trembled at her shadow, begged for mercy before she even spoke. But here, a human janitor, armed with nothing but a mop, returned to his cleaning as if her presence meant nothing at all. It was not arrogance. It was not disrespect. It was something more dangerous: indifference to her power. Around them, whispers began to spread as ministers crept closer, eyes widening in disbelief. Soldiers peered from the edges of the hall, waiting for her command to strike the insolent human down. Yet she said nothing. She did not lift her hand to punish him. Her claws curled slightly, then stilled. Her silence grew heavier, stranger, until even her counselors dared not breathe. The janitor felt the weight of their stares, but he did not stop. He wrung out his mop, dipped it in the bucket, and spoke in a low, almost careless voice. A floor doesn't clean itself. His words were plain, but in that moment they carried a boldness sharper than steel. The Queen's eyes narrowed. That simple sentence echoed through her like thunder. It was not a challenge, not a plea, but a truth. An ordinary truth from an ordinary man. Yet it rang louder in her mind than the countless speeches of her generals. The silence stretched, and for the first time in centuries the alien queen did not know what to do. She had returned to her empire with fury in her heart, but this nameless human had struck her with something far greater than fear. And so she remained there, frozen, staring at the janitor as if the fate of her throne now rested not on armies or conquests, but on the meaning of a simple act of kindness. Memories of loss. The Queen stood unmoving in the doorway, her soldiers and ministers waiting behind her, afraid to even whisper. Her silence stretched longer than the corridor itself, pressing on everyone like a weight too heavy to bear. She should have spoken. She should have ordered the human's execution for his boldness, or at least punished him for daring not to kneel. That was what her empire expected from her, what her throne demanded. Yet no words came. Her gaze clung to the janitor's simple act as if her heart refused to release it. And then, against her will, her mind pulled her back to the years she had buried. She saw a memory she had long fought to forget, a memory that had scarred her deeper than any blade. She saw her daughter. The girl had been small, fragile in a way no heir to a throne should have been. Her body was weak, her voice soft, her steps unsteady. Yet her eyes had been bright, always full of questions, always chasing after the smallest details of the palace life. She had laughed at things her mother had found foolish, smiled at moments that seemed meaningless to the empire. The Queen had tried to teach her strength, to harden her with lessons of power and command. But the child had only ever answered with laughter or gentle words. One day, the girl had stumbled in a hall much like this one. She had carried a small ceremonial object, far too heavy for her tiny arms, and it slipped from her grasp. The metal clattered against the ground, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence. The servants nearby had frozen. They had looked to the Queen, not the child. They had feared her wrath, not the girl's tears. None of them had moved. None had dared to help. They had chosen obedience over compassion, silence over kindness. The Queen herself had only stood still, too wrapped in pride and fury to bend down. Later that same year, sickness had taken the child. Fragile and weak, she had faded away before her mother's eyes. And when the Queen had finally held her one last time, the girl had whispered with her fading breath, "Why does no one help?" Those words had haunted the Queen through every battle she fought afterward, through every planet she conquered. She had crushed worlds, burned armies, and built an empire so vast it shook the stars. But none of it had silenced that final question. Now, in the forgotten corridors of her palace, she saw a simple human janitor kneel to help a servant child with spilled food. No hesitation, no fear, no calculation. He had simply helped because it was right. And in that moment, the memory of her daughter's question struck her again, sharper than any blade. Why does no one help? Her claws curled against her palms, her chest tightening as if a wound long closed had been torn open. She hated the weakness it brought, hated how the sight of this human's act had pulled her into the past she had tried to bury. Yet the truth was undeniable. This man had shown more strength in bending down to help a child than her empire had ever shown in conquering galaxies. The janitor continued working, unaware of the storm inside her. To him, the act was nothing. He had not done it for recognition, not for reward, not even for gratitude. He had done it because it was human nature to help, because even in the darkest places, humanity carried a spark that refused to die. The ministers behind her shifted uneasily. They waited for the Queen's judgment, certain that her silence could not last much longer. They expected her to lash out, to kill the human and remind everyone of her power. Some even whispered prayers under their breath, fearing that her hesitation meant she had grown weak, but she ignored them. Their voices were dust compared to the echo of her daughter's fading words. For the first time in years, the Queen's gaze softened. The fire in her eyes dimmed into something else, something far more dangerous than rage: grief. The janitor's act had awakened what no war, no rebellion, no council had been able to touch: her memory of love, of loss, of the child she could never hold again. The janitor finally noticed the stillness behind him. He turned, meeting her gaze fully. His expression carried no fear, no arrogance, only calm respect. He had seen enough of life to know when someone carried pain, and in her eyes he saw pain so deep it nearly drowned her. He said nothing, for he was only a janitor, and words were rarely his to give. But in the quiet way he stood, in the simple honesty of his presence, he spoke louder than anyone else in the room. The Queen did not speak either. She could not. Her throat felt tight, her chest heavy, as if grief itself had chained her voice. For centuries she had been known as a force of fire and steel, unyielding, merciless. But now she stood frozen, not by an enemy's blade, but by the echo of her daughter's voice and the reflection of it in a human janitor's kindness. And so the great alien Queen, feared across the stars, remained still in the dark hallway of her own palace, trapped not by power, but by memory. The silent confrontation. The hall grew heavier with every passing second. Ministers stood at the edges with their heads bowed, not daring to lift their eyes. Soldiers lined the walls, hands close to their weapons, ready for a command that had not yet come. The servants had long fled, their footsteps vanishing into the higher corridors, leaving only the Queen, the human janitor, and the suffocating silence between them. No one understood why the Queen had not spoken, why her claws had not torn him apart, why her wrath had not fallen like a storm. To the council, her hesitation was unthinkable. Yet she remained there, her golden eyes fixed on the human, as if the fate of her empire now depended on his next move. The janitor stood in the middle of the corridor, mop in hand, bucket at his side. He had expected death the moment he turned and met her gaze, but when it did not come, something within him steadied. Fear had always been his companion in this palace, but tonight, strangely, it did not rule him. He could feel the eyes of ministers and soldiers burning into him, their disbelief as sharp as blades. Yet he did not kneel, he did not beg, he did not run. He simply returned her gaze, his expression calm, his voice silent, and then lowered his eyes to his work again. The mop glided once more across the floor, as though nothing had changed. The ministers could not hold their tongues. One stepped forward, his robe sweeping the ground, his voice trembling but loud enough to echo. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing low, "this human mocks you by ignoring your presence. He should be punished. Allow us to strike him down and remind the Empire that disrespect has no place before the throne." Another joined in quickly, eager to prove his loyalty. "Yes, Majesty. One order, and this insolent slave will never rise again. Your silence must not be mistaken for weakness. Show them all that your return has restored fear to this palace." Their voices were sharp, but their courage was hollow. They wanted her to act because her inaction unsettled them. Yet the Queen raised her hand slowly, and the ministers fell silent at once, their words swallowed back in terror. She did not look at them, nor at the soldiers. Her gaze never moved from the janitor. The janitor felt her eyes pressing against him, searching, weighing him as if his soul were being judged. He straightened his shoulders, tightened his grip on the mop handle, and finally spoke. His voice was low but carried clearly through the stillness. A floor doesn't clean itself. A mess doesn't fix itself. Someone has to care enough to do it. The words were simple, almost foolish to the ministers who sneered at them. But to the Queen they struck like thunder. Her claws twitched at her sides, her breath sharp, though her face remained unreadable. She had heard countless speeches from generals, declarations from ministers, prayers from slaves. Yet none of them had carried the quiet weight of these plain words. The soldiers shifted uneasily. The silence stretched so long that the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Finally, one of the generals dared to step forward. "Majesty," he said carefully, "let me remove him. He is nothing. His words are nothing. Allow me to kill him where he stands, and your silence will no longer be mistaken for mercy." The queen's head turned, slowly, her eyes cutting into the general like blades of fire. He fell to his knees instantly, sweat dripping from his forehead, unable to meet her gaze. She said nothing, but the weight of her silence crushed him until he could not even raise his head. The soldiers around him stiffened, realizing they too would be destroyed if they spoke again. Her eyes returned to the janitor. He had not moved. His work was steady, his voice quiet now, his presence calm in a way that unsettled everyone else. He did not ask for mercy, nor did he demand respect. He acted as though her judgment did not matter, as though her power was just another shadow in a corridor he had long since learned to ignore. It was this indifference that shook her most. The galaxy feared her name. Empires had bent their knees before her. Stars themselves had seemed to burn brighter when she marched into war. Yet here stood a human janitor, who bent not out of fear, but continued working as though her presence was only another task to clean around. The queen's silence grew colder, heavier, until even her ministers dared not breathe. She could end him with a flick of her claw. She could erase his existence and no one would question it. Yet, deep in her chest, where rage had always lived, she felt something else rising. His words echoed again and again in her mind. Someone has to care enough to do it. For the first time in centuries, she questioned herself. Had she ever cared enough for the small things? Or had she only cared for power, for fear, for obedience? Her heart thundered with the question. Her claws trembled, but she still could not speak. And so the confrontation continued, not with blades, not with shouts, but with silence. The queen frozen in thought, the janitor working in calm defiance, and an empire holding its breath, waiting to see which one would break first. The human's words. The corridor was still, yet beneath the silence trembled a storm. Ministers held their breath, soldiers stood rigid, and no one dared move. All eyes were locked on the strange confrontation unfolding in the lowest level of the palace. A nameless human janitor standing before the Queen of the Stars. A woman feared across countless worlds. For the court, this scene was unthinkable. For the queen, it was unbearable. For the janitor, it was only another night at work. The janitor dipped his mop into the bucket, wrung it out with slow patience, and pushed it across the floor again. His simple movements rang louder than words, each stroke of the mop echoing with quiet defiance. The queen's gaze burned into his back like fire, but he did not falter. He felt her watching, waiting, testing, but he would not collapse under her silence. Finally, he lifted his head and spoke. His voice was calm, steady, not raised in challenge but spoken with the weight of truth. "Power is easy," he said. "Fear is easy. Anyone with claws, with armies, with fire in the skies can force others to bow. But caring is not easy. Seeing the small things, doing what no one else bothers to do, that is harder than conquest." The words struck the ministers like a slap. They glanced at each other in shock, horrified that a human slave dared speak so boldly before their queen. Soldiers gripped their weapons tighter, waiting for her order to silence him forever. But the queen did not move. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, her claws twitching but her body frozen in place. The janitor continued, his tone still plain, his gaze lowered as though he were only talking to himself. A floor doesn't clean itself. A child doesn't feed itself. A broken thing doesn't fix itself. Someone has to bend down, someone has to get their hands dirty, someone has to care. That's not weakness. That's the only thing that keeps a place alive. The soldiers shifted uneasily. They could not understand why she let him continue. Never before had anyone spoken so casually in her presence. Generals had shouted speeches, priests had offered chants, and rulers of other worlds had begged for mercy. but all of them had trembled under her silence. This man did not tremble. His voice was not loud, but it carried, and it carried because it was true. The queen's mind raged. She wanted to lash out, to silence him with the strike of her claw. Yet his words burrowed deeper with each passing second. Her heart remembered her daughter's voice, faint and fading, asking that final question. Why does no one help? And here, in her own palace, stood a human janitor whose every act seemed to answer that question. Because someone has to. Her ministers began to whisper among themselves, desperate to break the spell. Majesty, he insults you. Majesty, let us kill him. Majesty, the court will see this as weakness. Their voices cracked with fear, but still she did not raise her hand. She silenced them with a single glance, sharper than any blade. The janitor finally turned to face her fully. His expression was calm, his eyes tired but steady. He did not kneel, nor did he challenge her directly. Instead, he spoke as though speaking to the palace itself, as though his words were meant for the walls as much as the queen. You built this empire on fear, he said quietly. But fear doesn't last. Fear breaks, it rots. It leaves nothing behind but emptiness. Kindness, though, it grows. It plants seeds where nothing should live. And one day, it changes everything. His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The ministers recoiled as if struck. Soldiers shifted their stance, their faces hard but their eyes uncertain. For the first time, cracks appeared in the empire's unshakable order. They had all lived under fear, obeyed fear, worshipped fear. But deep inside, they too had longed for something else, something softer, something that could fill the void that fear never touched. The queen's heart pounded. His words pulled at the threads of her armor, threads she had wrapped around herself for centuries. She remembered her daughter's small smile, her laughter echoing in the halls, her weak arms struggling to carry things too heavy for her. The queen had thought herself strong because she had conquered. But as she stood before a man with a mop who spoke of kindness, she felt more exposed than she had in any battlefield. The janitor did not press further. He simply lowered his eyes again and continued his work, leaving the words to sink where they would. He was not a preacher, not a leader, not a hero in the eyes of the galaxy. He was only a man who cleaned floors, who hummed to himself, who shared bread with children. Yet his ordinary truths rang louder than the queen's armies ever had. The corridor remained tense. No order had been given, no punishment had been delivered. Yet something had shifted. The queen's silence was no longer the silence of command. It was the silence of someone listening, someone breaking, someone being changed. And though the ministers prayed she would strike him down, and the soldiers waited for her to unleash her fury, the alien queen stood frozen not by fear, but by the unbearable weight of a human's simple words. The frozen queen and the rising legend. The palace corridor seemed to stretch into eternity, its silence heavier than stone. The ministers no longer whispered. The soldiers no longer shifted. All of them stood as if caught in some invisible grip, waiting for the moment when the queen would break her silence. Her reputation had been carved in fire and blood. No one dared believe she would let a human janitor walk away after speaking such truths in her presence. Yet still she remained frozen. Her golden eyes burned into him, not with rage but with something far more dangerous. Conflict. The queen, who had bent empires to her will, who had brought entire worlds to their knees, was now standing still because of a man with scarred hands and a mop. The court could not understand it, but deep inside her heart she knew why. His words had cracked the armor she had carried for centuries, armor forged from grief and sharpened by conquest. His simple acts, helping a child, speaking plain truths, had done what no army had managed to do. He had made her remember who she once was and what she had once lost. The janitor finally leaned on his mop and looked at her again. He did not smile, nor did he tremble. His voice was steady when he spoke, though he knew his life could end with a single gesture from her. "I am not here to challenge you," he said quietly. "I am not here to change your throne, your laws, or your power. I am only here to do my work. But sometimes work is more than duty. Sometimes work is a reminder that life continues, even when everything else falls apart. The ministers gasped. His words, so simple and unadorned, carried more weight than all their carefully planned speeches. Soldiers who had spent their lives worshiping strength found themselves glancing at him with something they could not admit: respect. For the first time, the Empire saw a human not as weak, not as small, but as unshakable in his own way. The Queen's claws loosened at her sides. Her heart thundered with memories she had buried beneath battles and victories. She saw her daughter's small face, her weak hands, her dying question, "Why does no one help?" And then she saw this man, nameless and ordinary, bending down without hesitation to help where no one else would. The answer was here, staring back at her, wrapped in human form. Her lips parted. The ministers leaned forward, eager, terrified, waiting for the command to fall. But instead of rage, her voice came soft, almost fragile. "Who are you?" The janitor blinked, surprised that she had spoken at last. He could have given her his name, but he knew it meant nothing to her. So he answered with the same plain honesty that had guided every word he spoke. "Just a man doing his work," he said. The words echoed through the hall like thunder, not because they were loud, but because they carried truth that could not be silenced. A shiver spread through the soldiers. Ministers swallowed hard, unable to believe their queen had asked a question and accepted such a simple answer. The queen herself stood trembling, her silence broken not by command but by humility. For the first time in living memory, the alien queen lowered her gaze. It was not a bow, not an act of submission, but it was a moment that shattered the image of her invincibility. In that simple lowering of her eyes, she admitted that she had been touched by the words and acts of a human janitor, and that moment, though quiet and small, would ripple across the stars like the shockwave of a dying sun. The ministers, stunned into stillness, dared not speak. The soldiers remained frozen, their weapons limp at their sides. The janitor bent down again, dipping his mop into the bucket, and returned to his task. To him, nothing had changed. To the galaxy, everything had. That night, word spread in whispers that quickly became roars. Servants told each other that the queen had frozen before a human. Ministers confessed in secret that she had not punished him. Soldiers murmured in disbelief that she had asked him a question, and he had answered without fear. From the lowest worker to the highest council, the story grew. A human janitor had stood before the most feared queen in the galaxy, and she had trembled. Across worlds, the legend began to spread. It was told in slave camps, in soldiers' barracks, in dark taverns and bright marketplaces. They called him not by name but by what he was, the janitor. A man who carried no sword, who held no throne, who had no army, yet who had shown a queen the strength of humanity with nothing but kindness and simple words. The queen did not speak of that night again, but her silence carried new weight. Her wrath did not vanish, but it softened at the edges. Ministers who once feared only punishment now felt her gaze linger longer when they ignored the weak. Soldiers who once believed strength was only in conquest now hesitated before striking down the helpless. Something had shifted in the Empire, subtle yet unstoppable. And at the heart of that change was the memory of a janitor with a mop, whose ordinary humanity had shaken an entire throne.